Cool. So, hi, I'm Jamie. I'm going to kick us off with talking to you about some experiences about being an open source maintainer on what is mostly a hobby project, and it's used by a load of companies and a load of angry users. So, who am I? For those of you that don't know me, I'm mainly known by my URL, jvt.me. I'm on like all the bajillion different socials. Go to my Elsewhere page; it's got all the links. So, over the last decade or so, I've been building a load of open source. I've been trying to solve a lot of my own problems and sharing them for other people to use if they want to as well, but primarily just for me. And so I've got about 40 projects and a few different services around things like the indie web and owning your data, in the Java and Go ecosystems, more recently around things like dependency management, so things like software bill of materials and insights into your data and how you're using stuff. But also my blog itself, which is probably my longest running open source project. There's almost 1,100 posts on there, most of which include open source code snippets. But I'm mostly known for OAPI CodeGen, which we're going to be talking about today, and previously the Jenkins Job DSL plugin and being on the maintainer team at Wiremark. Now, I probably don't have to convince everyone that open source is unequivocally great. And being able to solve problems and share solutions for other people to get the benefit of is amazing. And being able to fix problems generally, and being able to be like a force multiplier, and being able to fix something for someone that actually unlocks loads of other people getting that fix. And I owe so much to open source, and I don't know where I would be in my career or my life if I wasn't so engaged with the community. And so being an open source maintainer is really rewarding, except for when it isn't. So for those of you that didn't notice on my title slide, I called myself a tired maintainer. And I am sorry in advance, you will be seeing this graphic a lot over the next couple of days. It's the classic XKCD dependency. And one of the things here is that open source maintainers generally are that little load-bearing piece. And Chris Brando recently said this on the Fall Through podcast, that becoming an open source maintainer, you are going to become a load-bearing member of society, whether you want to or not. And it starts with like shipping a project and getting the first few users and being like, oh, great, people are using it. Then fast forward a year and you're like, oh God, why are so many people using it? I wrote a post a couple of years back about, does the tech industry thrive on free work? And the spoiler is yes. And so it's not just things like people thinking of a solution like while they're washing their dishes to a problem they had at work. There's also people who will do things like blog and open source outside of work because it's so much harder to do it during work hours that they're like, you know what, I won't even deal with that process. I will spend my precious free time on this earth doing this. So OAPI CodeGen, as I mentioned, is one of the projects I currently maintain, and it's a command line tool and library for taking OpenAPI API descriptions and converting them to Go code. It's the largest idiomatic Go code generator in the ecosystem for OpenAPI, which is a lot of caveats. And one of the problems with OpenAPI is it is really difficult. It is really annoying. As Quobix recently wrote an article about this. You have things like, first of all, just like YAML anchors versus plain JSON specs. But you also have things like JSON pointers. You have subtly different implementations of JSON schema. And to actually build tooling and understand how things work, you really need to be led by examples of complex things people are doing. But complexity has a cost, because the technically correct or most amazing way of describing what a JSON object can look like is going to use some functionality that not all the tools understand. And so across the different tools that you interact with, you're going to have to work to the common denominator. So OAPI CodeGen is fairly widely used. So there's over 10,000 public usages. It's something that doesn't necessarily even show up in package manifests. So there's a little bit more than that. And so over the years, we've grown in popularity. So these red marks are a couple of releases. So this was around the time I started using the project. And not long after, I made my first contribution. And then I emailed the maintainer to be like, hey, I really like this project. I've been helping out on a couple of issues. Would you like a hand? To which the current maintainer was like, why? Why would you want to help? There is so much work. And I was like, it'll be fine. So over the next year or so, we did a number of other releases. You notice that there was a massive gap and then a lot of really frequent releases. And this is a common thing you'll see, like maintainers will maybe have more energy or more time to focus on a thing at a given time, but then there will also be big lulls. And so you can see over the next couple of years, there's actually massive gaps between the releases because as maintainers, we are very busy. We don't have a lot of time to focus on the project. And that purple line is when we actually moved the project into a community organization so we could start accepting GitHub sponsors. Because previously it was maintained under a GitHub org that was a company that was acquired by NVIDIA. And being technically backed by a company meant that we couldn't accept sponsorship, which is fair. So we moved it out and have actually got some sponsors, which is great. But one of the things here is that being a maintainer of a big project, even a small project, but especially with big projects, is you get some fun users to interact with. And they don't sugarcoat things. They're very happy telling you what they think. So you'll get things like, oh, just review my changes, or it's not that much work to look at this PR, or it's a straightforward issue. The thing here is, like, recently we've spent a lot of time trying to improve the way that we document and test our project in a way that makes it more sustainable in the future. But the problem with that is we have loads of open PRs, we have new contributions coming in that don't necessarily follow that. So it's a mix of we need to coach new contributors into following that new pattern, but we also have to retrofit in a number of cases. The other one is, as Solomon Hykes said a few years back, no is temporary, yes is forever. Every time you merge one of those PRs, you as the maintainer have to maintain that forever. And like, you can remove things with breaking changes, but that's a lot longer to actually think about and plan for. And so you have to kind of be a bit more careful about how much you actually want to take on and what the scope of the project is. One of my least favorite messages, but also one that I have done in the past to maintainers, is when can we expect to see this fixed? What's the ETA? How long is it going to take you? The PR's there, just accept it. And often, like, as an overstretched maintainer with not a lot of time and people doing more contributions than we can feasibly keep on top of, that also makes that difficult. One of the really fortunate things is my employer Elastic gives me 4 hours a month to work on the project, and that's great. Like, that is really appreciative on work hours. But it doesn't magically solve everything because we still have a ton of work to do, and 4 hours a month isn't going to cut it. So then, as I mentioned, we also have GitHub sponsors. So there's a number of companies that do actually pay me primarily to work on the project. But again, it's a handful of hours, and there are only so many hours in the day, so many hours in the week. And I have other projects I want to work on, both personal life projects, recover from a busy job, stuff like that. So it's also difficult. And there is a lot to do. So as of this morning, there are 488 open issues, 159 open PRs, of which half of the open PRs were raised in the last half a year, of which only 4 have been merged. And we've had a number of issues created. And a lot of these issues are also things like, oh, this complex spec that I've taken from somewhere else doesn't quite work. And it's like, okay, well, there's a number of different things to actually triage that and make it possible. And for instance, like, I recently spent a full, like, 10-hour day working on the project, and I got through 2 issues and reviewed a few PRs. Didn't even merge anything. And it's things like that that it actually takes a lot more work due to the complexity of the domain, but also due to just the amount of stuff that we're constantly getting. And more specifically, like, for me personally as a maintainer, those of you may recognize this scene from Malcolm in the Middle as a good representation of what ADHD is. So I have ADHD, and I will often go on a side quest. So I'll start reviewing a PR, and then, or maybe looking at merging something, and I will spot something. And then while I'm there, I'll be like, okay, I need to go and fix that as well. And then I spot something else. And then an hour goes by, I've got nothing done, and I'm about 7 side quests away. But it can also be really hard to start, especially when you see that overwhelming number of, okay, there's 500 open issues, some that are open since like the first month the project was created. And so I'm also trying to keep on top of things like that. The other one is I don't like it, but I find that I do respond to the noisiest users who ping me, even if it is just to say, okay, yes, we will get to this at some point. Which means that the nice humans who are not constantly pinging maintainers are waiting patiently, are also not getting seen to, which sucks. The other one is that I am working mostly on my own. So my co-maintainer is very busy, and the reason I got involved was to try and help out. But this means that, for all intents and purposes, it is just me doing all the work. And so we could look at onboarding more people. If I already feel like I don't have a lot of time to do that work, how am I going to onboard someone else, give them the relevant coaching and experience to actually get them up to speed, which is immensely powerful in the long term, but kills the project even more so in the short term. And even to like start doing things like this, I also want to spend some time working on governance. Bought this book last year, have not yet even started reading it. Because again, if I'm going to have time to sit down and read a book about my open source project, maybe I should just spend the time on the open source project. So yeah, it's difficult. So a couple of tips for how you as an open source citizen could be a little bit better. The first one's be nice. Like I hit a massive milestone in open source last year. Got my first abusive email, yay. It was fun. I did some searching, found out where the person worked for, and was like, okay, I at least have that ammunition for if they do anything. I'm also a little bit of a spiteful person, so I was very, very, very tempted to never touch the issues that they had tagged, which weren't even issues that they'd originally raised. But I was like, you know what, maybe I will do this. Importantly, like lead with empathy. This goes both ways on the maintainers and the user side, but remember that there are people on the other side of the screen who have their own lives, who may be trying to squeeze this in the 10 minutes before they go to bed because they've just seen that you've hit 500 issues and, oh God, why is there so much stuff? Pay for the privilege if you can, especially if the project isn't backed by a company where people are spending their actual working hours on. See if you can pay the maintainers, or at the very least see if you can support through some other means, like being able to contribute people to the project. And yeah, just say something nice. Like if there's literally one thing you do off the back of this, go and say thank you to one of the maintainers that you rely on so heavily. So yeah, just to close off, remember that there are humans on both sides. Send a thank you and pay your maintainers. Thank you.
We have some time if anyone has any questions.
What do you think about the public fund proposals that in Europe they are talking about extending sovereign tech agency to EU level? What do you think about public money in this space? Yeah, sure. What do you think about public fund proposals? For instance, right now, I'm just coming from FOSDEM. There's this conversation on extending sovereign tech agency to European level. Mm-hmm. What do you think about public money in this space?
I think it's really good. So I know a number of people who work in the UK government, and they, as a thing, cannot pay for open source, but they can contribute time, which in a lot of cases is as good. But if we can get more public funding of open source, that is also very, very good.
As someone who's also inherited open source projects, how do you deal with when you get a pull request or an issue and you don't feel like you've got the context to handle this pull request? Maybe the person that opened the pull request knows the project better than you. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that?
So what I've been trying to do is try and build up my mental model through things like documentation. So one of the things we do with the project is we have internal tests that have a full example of how the thing would be used. So for us, it's building that as a way of what is the minimum project that I could do to actually exercise this feature and understand things. And sometimes that actually takes a long time to get that idea and to build that up. But by the time I've done that, and I've generally written that documentation as well, that then gives me that context of, okay, now I know, A, the project a little bit more, and how this feature is going to be used.
Thanks for sharing the approach of inheriting and like coming on board to an existing project. But can you speak to maybe about how and when you might walk away from a project and how to kind of divest yourself from that and hand it over?
Yeah, so that's something I've kind of thought about with this project. But the main thing is I want to leave it in a place where there are multiple people who are able to start supporting it. One of the projects I started co-maintaining on was WireMock, which already had a number of people on the maintainer team. There was a company behind it and everything. So there was enough back in there that I could get involved, and then I actually could just leave because it didn't make too much of a difference. Trying to have a succession plan is really useful. But I think at the same time, you do not owe anyone anything. The software is provided as is. And even though it's a nice thing to do, if it's burning your mental health, you should focus on that rather than some random internet people.
All right. Thank you so much.